Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. In this session we're going to discuss rent. Rent to an economist does not mean what it means to the general layperson. Rent to most people is the payment you make for something like an apartment, but that's not so for an economist. Rent to an economist is the price paid for the use of land or other natural resources that are completely fixed in total supply. When we talk about supply and demand, when the price goes up, P1, Q1, P2, Q2, the businessman, holding costs constant on one supply curve, has an incentive to produce more. So at price 10, holding cost constant, profit is 3. If price rises to 12 and cost remains constant at 7, then profit rises to 5. And so there is a greater incentive at a higher price to produce more goods. There's a connection between quantity and price, a direct relationship. We call that price. However, there are some things for which more can't be produced regardless of price. Land and other natural resources are one. Mark Twain once said, "Buy land, it's something they're not making any more of." So this would be the supply curve of land, for example. And no matter what the demand curve, the price, the supply will not change. So the quantity is fixed. So we no longer refer to this as a price, we refer to it as a rent. Rent is the payment for something for which, at different payments, the supply does not change. The connection between price and quantity is broken. And so we have to have a word for that instead of using price, where there's this positive relationship between price and quantity. Where that relationship is broken, we're going to call, instead of using the word price, we're going to use the word rent. This represents a perfectly inelastic supply curve. This is a positively sloped supply curve. I like to remember the difference between purely inelastic, we should make an I out of it, and purely elastic, we should make an E out of it. Right. So in this example, you can't use this variable to explain this variable. This variable can be any amount and will have no change on this. So this one is independent of changes in this one. Here, this variable is independent of changes in this one. This variable can be any amount and will have no impact on this variable. These are independent relationships. So here's an example of the perfectly inelastic supply curve, and the amount paid for that, the rent, is going to be determined by the only active variable, demand. When demand increases for something, the rent will go up. When demand decreases for this, for acres of land, for example, the rent will go down. The unique feature of our analysis on supply side, for all practical purposes, the supply of land is perfectly inelastic, both in the short and long run, as reflected by the supply curve being perfectly inelastic. Land is a free and non-reproducible gift of nature. The economy has only so much land, and that's it. Of course, within limits, any parcel of land can be brought more usable by clearing, drainage, or irrigation, or fertilization. But these capital improvements are not changing the amount of land itself, so the productivity of the land can be changed, but not the quantity of land. Increases in the usability of land affect only a small fraction of the total amount of land. Changes in demand. Because the supply of land is fixed, the demand is the only active determinant of land rent. Supply is passive. And what determines the demand for land? The same as determine the demand for any resource, which we studied in a prior session. The price of the product that is produced on land. Again, a resource price is determined from the price of the good it produces. So the higher the value of a product produced, sold, will cause the price of the resource, land in this case, to be higher also. The productivity of the land, and that will be determined by the quantity and quality of quality resources used in combination with land, and the prices of other resources that are combined with land. Right, so the greater the demand, the higher the rent. The lower the demand, the lower the rent. Land rent, a surplus payment. The perfectly inelastic supply of land must be contrasted with the relatively elastic supply of capital, such as apartment buildings, machinery. In the long run, capital is not fixed in total supply. A higher price gives entrepreneurs an incentive to make more of it. That means those supply curves are upward sloping, positively sloped. That's the incentive function I referred to earlier. Not so with land. Rent serves no incentive function. Whether the rent is $10,000, $50, $1, or $0, the same amount of land is available for production. If land is a gift of nature, not produced by people, costs nothing to produce, and would be available even without rental payments, why should rent be paid to those who by historical accident, inheritance, happen to be landowners? Socialists have long argued that all land rents are unearned income. In other words, if I go to work in the morning and produce something, I have earned my income. If I make machinery and sell it, I provide capital and have earned income. However, land is a gift of nature, and so by mere possession of it, you haven't earned income. They urge that land should be nationalized, owned by the state, so that any payments for its use can be used by the government to further the well-being of the entire population, rather than being profitable to the landowning minority. Around the turn of the century, the government, which always collected most of its income from taxes on imports, found that was deficient, and they were starting to look around for other ways of raising income to the government. And one of the ways they discussed was a tax on land, a rent. This did not work out, though, and as a result, they passed an amendment to, I believe, the 20th Amendment, to I'll have to check on that, to raise money through an income tax, which is what we have today. But back then, there was an economist called Henry George, and he criticism of rental payments has taken the form of a single tax movement, which gained significant support in the late 19th century. Spearheaded by Henry George's provocative book, Progress and Poverty, 1879, supporters of this reform movement held that economic rent could be heavily taxed, or even taxed away, without diminishing the availability of the land. Therefore, the productive potential of the economy as a whole would be unchanged by taxing the rent of land away. If you made something on the land, so if you grow corn, you get a profit from the corn, but you don't get a profit from the land. George observed that as population grew and the geographic frontier closed, landowners enjoyed larger and larger rents from their landownings. That increase in rents was the supply of growing demand for a resource whose supply was perfectly inelastic. Some landlords were receiving fabulously high incomes, not through any productive effort, but solely through their owning advantageously located land. George insisted that these increases in land rent belonged to the economy. He held that land rents should be heavily taxed and the revenue spent for public uses. So let's ignore how much the crops are sold for on land. If under our normal system you earn profits from the corn, as well as you had to incorporate into the price of the corn grown, for seed and fertilizer, the price you paid for the land, then the price for the good is going to be higher. But if land is a gift of nature, and you could tax away that value, then the government has raised money, and the landowner, if he's left with only $1, will still provide that land at only $1, because there is no connection between the price of land and its quantity. And so by reducing the profit an entrepreneur makes on the profit of the land will not reduce the amount of goods made on the land. In seeking popular support for his idea of land taxation, George proposed taxes on rental income be the only tax leveled by the government, And this did not pan out, so eventually we have an income tax. Georgia's case for taxing land was not only based on equity or fairness, but also efficiency. That is, a tax on land is efficient because, unlike virtually every other tax, it does not alter the use of the resource being taxed. A tax on wages, for example, reduces after-tax wages and may weaken the incentive to work, a connection between the wage rate and the amount of work provided. An individual who decides to work for $10 before tax may decide to retire when an income tax reduces the wage after tax to $8. There are some criticisms of Henry George's ideas. Current levels of government spending could not be paid for with a land tax alone. But no tax on its own can pay for all government expenses. So, I don't view that as a valid criticism. Most income payments consist of a mixture of elements such as rent, interest, wages, and profits. Yes, it takes 4 factors of production to produce a good. Land is only one, which is paid with the rent. Land is typically improved in some way, and economic rent cannot be readily disentangled. So in practice it would be difficult to, yes, but we have estimates on all kinds of things when you pay taxes. So an estimate could be developed. So-called unearned income accrues to many other types of landowner, any other people besides landowners, especially when the economy is growing. So stock, for example, profit on stock is called capital gain. But if you buy stock, you're not actually involved in the company making the goods. The company is, and those workers will get paid, and some of those profits that are left over will be paid to the stockholders. Well, that's unearned income, much like payment for land is. So we do tax capital gains, so why couldn't we tax rent? So just because unearned income is earned on more investments than just land does not necessarily mean we shouldn't be taxing land. Historically, a piece of land is likely to have changed ownership many times. Former owners may have been beneficiaries of past increases in the value of land. It would hardly be fair to impose a heavy tax on current owners who paid competitive markets for price of land. That's true, but you could grandfather these people and then tax the next owner who would be making the purchase of land with the knowledge that it would be taxed more heavily. So this is a discussion of rent, the payment for something for which the quantity cannot change, which is different than when price and quantity does signal when price does signal an increase in the quantity supplied. We're going to practice this in a worksheet next.